Thank you for the opportunity to do this here today. I have my video off, and I will hope that Audrey or Carrie will be able to facilitate a discussion afterwards. I'm going to present on some work we have done. There's a whole bunch of collaborators. I'm acknowledging some of the folks that were part of what I will be focusing on for part of my presentation. That's a new paper that just came out in Journal of Ecology that's freely available for download, so it's not behind a paywall. And focusing on the work that we have done in the past few years or decades, so to speak. So my challenge here today is to tell you who is the more successful manager. And I have no idea who these individuals are. I just grabbed that off the web. And I'm trying to convince you that the person on the left is actually the more successful manager, with maybe the the benefit of age and wisdom and not being able to bend over versus the activism of the person on the right. So that's my challenge here today, and I hope I will be successful, because in the end I think that will be a better management approach for garlic mustard and maybe a few other species as well. To get to that point, I want to share with you my garlic mustard roller coaster over the last couple of decades. There is no end, no beginning, just an intermediary in this picture. And so that has a little bit been my involvement with garlic mustard as well. Why garlic mustard? Garlic mustard, this is work by Charlotte Alliaria a few years ago, who interviewed forest or land managers in the Northeast. All the dots that you see here on that map is where people answered a questionnaire that Charlotte developed, and the top species that came up as for the people that answered this questionnaire was really garlic mustard. And there's lots of motivations for invasive plant species management. I list some of them here. There are the suspected impacts that garlic mustard has. So garlic mustard is at the top of the list for a lot of land managers that are concerned about the well-being of the woodlands and landscapes that they're managing. That's not just in the Northeast, it's beyond that. So I got involved in the entire situation in 1998, well over 2 decades. That entire project kicked off at the Natural Areas Association meeting in Michigan, where to get this entire thing started, actually a hat was passed around among the participants. Yes, we were meeting in person at that time to get this going. We were very successful in getting initial funding from the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program, that's part of DoD, to actually focus on the development of biological control. So that funding became available in 1999. We contracted with folks in Europe at CABI that developed the biocontrol work for purple loosestrife, which was also something that the land managers wanted to repeat, maybe for garlic mustard. And at the same time, we initiated it for Phragmites. So we focused on the biocontrol development that was largely work done in Europe. We surveyed for organisms that may be present in North America. We tried to develop a long-term monitoring protocol, which will be the focus of my presentation, and then focus on demography, because ultimately what we wanted to see is a decline in the populations of garlic mustard over time. And at the time that we were initiating this, we were thinking that the focus for that would be insects that would be attacking garlic mustard in the native range, that we then bring over to North America and help us in the management of garlic mustard. We were successful in getting an EPA grant in 2000, together with John Mertz and Vicky Nuzzo, to look at the impact of forest invaders. We focused on garlic mustard, Japanese stiltgrass, and barberry in that time. And we looked at the ecological interactions, plants, salamanders, insects. Andrea Davalos looked at the insects in particular. We looked at germination and seed bank. There were many more different funders over time. And in 2007, CERDIP once again came to our assistance with funding for work that we then conducted at West Point, the military academy, to look at multiple stressors that involve deer and earthworms, nutrient addition, and invertebrates as well. So over time, we have spent quite a bit of money and energy and created a whole bunch of publications. And so I know you cannot read this, or maybe you want a screen grab, but I believe this is being recorded so you can go back and get these. Many of these will not be freely available, although some of them may be. If you want some of these papers, you can get a hold of me and I will share PDFs with you for that. So I want to, from all this work from over 2 decades, there's a few take-home messages. One, garlic mustard has a long-term seed bank that lasts over 10 years that we published a couple of years ago in Journal of Ecology. So reducing the seed bank to almost nothing will take you a very, very long time, maybe forever. We found no impact of the ground beetles and their prey. Earthworm invasions are first, then garlic mustard follows. As of today, we have never seen garlic mustard establish populations in the field that are not invaded by earthworms. So it's a follower, not a preparer for ecosystems to deteriorate. There was no impact of garlic mustard on salamanders. The earthworms, once again, were the drivers of the ecosystem deterioration and had the major negative impacts on the salamanders. There was no impact of garlic mustard on the associated vegetation. The deer were the drivers of deterioration. That was all published in 2009 with Vicky Nuzu as the lead author in conservation biology. On the other hand, we also saw that there are very safe biocontrol agents that are available. They haven't been approved for release in the US, but they are very safe, so there's no concern about that. Here are just a couple of examples. I want you to focus on the left side, which is the density of garlic mustard. If you put fences up, that declines to very little in the open. So these are fences that were in existence at West Point for a little while. Similar things here measured as biomass, because it's really difficult to count the number of stems for microstegium happens for Japanese stilt grass. So by doing nothing else but taking the deer out of the picture, garlic mustard and other invaders can decline. Vicky Nuzu did a study at Fermilab in Illinois, where she had permanent quadrats, and she recorded the vegetation over time. So it's quite a while ago. And so what she saw was the increase in garlic mustard in the area, but also an increase in the deer population that threatened the native plants that were there. So Fermilab instituted a 90% deer herd reduction through culls that were conducted in there. And what you can see on this picture is that garlic mustard keeps on increasing and then are declining, but doesn't have an effect on the native vegetation. The native vegetation responds strongly to the deer herd reduction, and so thrives in the presence of garlic mustard. So there was no effect other than through the deer culling. So what we instituted with the initiation of the biocontrol program for garlic mustard, the research part, we wanted to make sure that if we introduce these insects, these are all insects, by the way, at some point, that we capture what would happen to garlic mustard over time. Many of you may be familiar with the idea there are these, or have seen it, that these are strong fluctuations in annual abundance, the recruitment from the seed bank that may be associated with climate. It may be different in the south than it is further north. So we wanted to capture that and wanted to make sure that what we're attributing to potentially the release of the insects would be accompanied by good data, background data. So we developed a standardized protocol with help of a lot of land managers, and we established them in high garlic mustard density. Whenever you see a GM, excuse me, that would stand for garlic mustard as an abbreviation. We did these in locations where we didn't have an idea how long the infestations are there. We measured rosette and garlic mustard adult presence and a couple of other things in June and October. count the stems, the rosettes, measure the stem height, counted the saliques to have an idea about fecundity, because ultimately we wanted to develop demographic models as well to see how garlic mustard behaves over time. We recorded insect attack to see what other species may be there, and a couple of other things. We trained volunteers, and then we collected data over time at many different sites. So here you see a map of the research sites that are part of what I will be presenting to you. And you can kind of see they're going from New Jersey through New York and Michigan, Indiana into Illinois. So there's a lot of people that participated in that over time. The time series are of different duration. I will show you some data on that. But what is important in this context is to remember how garlic mustard spread to Eastern North America. So this is a shot from a paper that Lankow and others published in PNAS in 2009 that kind of shows the residence time of garlic mustard in different areas of the country. Now, this didn't spread, or garlic mustard didn't spread like a wave through this, but it's an interpolation. And you can kind of see at the time that the sampling was done, which was probably in 2007 and 2008, that really there are very recent invasions or arrival in the Midwest, while garlic mustard initially was documented in New York on Long Island in the late 1800s, and then it spread westward. There were a couple of hops that arrived in Chicago earlier than in other places, just associated with travel patterns, as we see with a lot of other species. It obviously wasn't an ornamental, so it spread through different means. But basically, we see an east-west gradient, and that's reflected in this map, which will be important for what I'm showing you next. So based on these years, here is something that happened over time to garlic mustard at our research sites. So this is all collapsed, all research sites put together, except we have northeastern locations in the top part of this graphics, and the Midwestern part in the lower portions. And we go about adult density to cover stem height and the number of saliques over time. I'm not going to go into how this all was done and how it was smoothed. You can find that all out if you're interested in the ecology letters papers. It's described there. But what we see is decline over time in adult density in the cover, while stem height and the number of saliques seem to be much less affected, but there are differences in the way that this plays out between the Northeast and the Midwest. You can see some fluctuation in adult density in the Midwest. The cover declines over time with some variation in there as well. Why the stem height declines so strongly in the Midwest, we don't know exactly. So this is the pattern. I told you early on that we established quadrats in areas that had a strong garlic mustard density, but we also wanted to understand whether the cover declines as a function of initial density. And you see here that the darker colors show higher garlic mustard density at the beginning of our study. The pattern basically is the same. These lines are all parallel, and they're all declining over time. And while the initial density has an influence on the cover of garlic mustard, for sure, if you have more stems, you have higher cover of garlic mustard, the pattern is the same. So there was no influence of initial cover or stem density on the pattern that developed over time. What I'm showing you here is a spaghetti graph, or a bunch of spaghetti graphs of stem height at these different places. Here you have the names and where they're located with the two-letter state code in there. Each individual gray line represents the height of garlic mustard at a permanent quadrat that we established, the 50 by 1 meter quadrat that we have as a permanent location. And then the darker line is the mean of them all. See, there's lots of fluctuation of individual quadrats, and the mean shows it over time. And just be aware that obviously this is the height of the existing stems. There are always some stems in these quadrats. And so the height is not, there is some decline, but it's not that strongly affected as some of the other parameters. But what we also saw was that over time, and the longer it went, that we lost garlic mustard presence in some of our research quadrats. So I need to make sure that you understand that's not garlic mustard present at a site, but in our permanent monitoring quadrat. And once again, there is a difference between the Northeast and the Midwest. So in the Northeast, over time, and there's a function of longitude in there as well, we saw a decline in the proportion of quadrats that were actually occupied by garlic mustard. That decline was stronger in the Northeast. And remember, that's where the residence time, and the further east you go, the residence time is longer for garlic mustard. So there seems to be an association with how long garlic mustard is present in a region of how fast the decline and how substantial the decline of garlic mustard is in these permanent monitoring quadrats. So there's a clear function of that. So ultimately what we wanted to do, and I said at the beginning, we wanted to put this all into a demographic model to have an ability to kind of forecast what the behavior of the garlic mustard would be at the population level, not just at the quadrat level. And so for doing that, ecologists use a matrix of a transition matrix of the life stages of garlic mustard. We could do that for any animal, for an annual plant that doesn't, with a seed bank or so. Here, garlic mustard is a biennial plant, right? So you have the S representing the seed bank, and a particular seed can either stay in the seed bank and germinate. That would get to a rosette stage where it spends the better part of a year growing as a rosette. All the rosettes will bolt and become plants or die. So that's then represented in the P. These are the plants, the full mature individuals that then produce seeds again that get into the seed bank. And so the cycle continues. And these different symbols there represent how likely it is for an individual garlic mustard to transition from one to the other. So we use that to come up with a forecast based on what we measured at these different sites, plus what other people had done about seed bank survival, germination rates, and other things. We plugged it all into a model. And if you put all the sites together, this is what you get. What you need to understand in terms of population growth rates, if the population growth rates, it's indicated by a lambda, is 1, the population is stable. If the population growth rate is above 1, the population is expected to grow. And the larger lambda is, the faster that population growth will be. If the population growth rate drops below 1, those populations are going to shrink. So there's a population decline. And you can see here that the population growth rates, these are all the different garlic mustard sites that we have in here with a 95% confidence interval. Over time, over a period here of a little over a decade, all the sites transition from a population growth rate of more than 1, where populations are expected to expand, to decline to less than 1. If you look at that over all the different sites that we have in our data set, you can see that the longer data sets are the more informative one, but at all the sites, you can see the slope going down, and some of them have not transitioned into going below 1, but many of them have. And as I said, once again, here the value is in the long-term data sets that we have. Not everybody monitored as long as we have worked in some places where we did the research, and some are only a few years long, but together they're very informative of what we're having. So, all right, so we have a pattern here that indicates that garlic mustard will disappear, not entirely, but shrink in populations over time at our research quadrats. We didn't say anything about the sites, and we were wondering what that would mean, or what the mechanisms were. We were lucky to have the ability to observe an ongoing invasion. That's the hillside where we actually did work. Vicky and I spent many years early on after we bought the property where we live now, trying to do what a lot of other people do, go out in the spring, spend every waking hour that you have able to do management on your property, trying to log and prevent this from running through our woods. In places where we didn't work, we saw this invasion early on, and then it became a massive infestation. But over time, we also saw that the vigor of the plants declined in the places that it initially invaded. While the vigor of the plants, basically the height and how thick the rosettes were, was at a traditional maximum extent that we saw in areas that were just very recently invaded. So this is basically what we saw. You know, you have the dinner plate, almost sized leaves of rosettes early on, almost full cover with few other plants in between of garlic mustard early on. Then the plants bolt, you know, 1.50 meters or taller. And then over time, in the very same places where they're growing very vigorously, we saw tiny puny plants that are, and you can see 3 inches tall here, so a little over 10 centimeters. They will still put out a seed, but this is what happened over time. So what was going on in these places? We tried to understand that, and we used concepts of soil feedback, and I'm going to explain that in a moment to you. And we did a full factorial design where we collected soils, where what I called different invasion histories. So places on the same hillside where there was no garlic mustard history, so we call them uninvaded. Recent garlic mustard, where garlic mustard had just arrived, and as I said, we were able, because it was at our home place, that we were able to observe that. So there were about 2 years invaded, and old garlic mustard invasion areas that were invaded for 3 years or longer. So we collected soils on these, and then we did 3 different treatments. We had a control where we didn't do anything. We fertilized, we used a fertilizing treatment because some ideas were that garlic mustard meat just robbed the soil of its ability to, or of its nutrient. Where that would go, I'm not entirely sure, but we wanted to see what the fertilizing treatment would be, and then autoclaved it to reduce potential negative effects of soil microorganisms that are there. This would leave any allelopathic effects or so that would be on a chemistry basis intact. And then we use 2 species, garlic mustard and sugar maple, but I will only focus on garlic mustard because we didn't have that much success preventing the sugar maple seedlings from being eaten by rodents, so we couldn't say much about that. So here is what we actually saw, where we use AP here. This is from the paper that we just published that stands for Alliaria petiolata, so garlic mustard. And you go from an invasion from left to right, where we have no garlic mustard, to where garlic mustard just recently invaded, or the old invasion front, and we have, or the old invaded areas. At the top, we see biomass. In the middle graph, we see the height, and below is a reproductive effort. And in each of these sub-panels, what you see going from left to right is the control, where we didn't do anything, then where we added nutrients, and then where it was autoclaved. So I will be focusing on the biomass here. What you do not see here is the survival. The survival was greatly reduced, and that's the major factor that we also saw in our field work, that if you have longer invasion history of garlic mustard, the survival of particular of the rosettes is greatly reduced. And so what is happening here, if you have a control and there's no garlic mustard, you fertilize that, your biomass output increases. So that's clearly visible. It's the anticipated effect. If you autoclave that, so you prevent some of the negative soil feedback or microorganisms that would be affecting garlic mustard in a detrimental way, you actually have slightly higher slightly higher biomass than in the control, where nothing was done. Although these things are not necessarily significant to the control. Different letters above the columns indicate significant effects. If you go to recently invaded or even the old infestation, you can kind of see the suppression of the biomass that is happening, and that nutrient addition doesn't do much to improve on that. Although if you autoclave that, you take an effect and the biomass increases with similar effects on height and the number of soliques. And the pattern is almost identical in the old invasion areas. So what's happening here and what is happening at our field sites, although we need more support from other places where we can follow an invasion sequence, is something: how does plant soil feedback actually happen? So I tried to find a really good slide that explains what soil feedbacks and negative soil feedback in particular is. I wasn't able to find that. I'm not entirely sure why, but I spent a couple of hours trying to find that, and then I decided I'm just going to make my own graph here. So basically what plant soil feedback is if you grow a plant in an environment, whether that's a pot or whether that's a field or whether it's your garden, the plant, through root exudates and to some other processes, will influence the microbial community that's in the soil. Every plant does that, whether it's introduced or native, it doesn't matter what is happening. You may be most familiar with that from some of the rotation that you are required if you garden. You don't put potatoes when you have grown potatoes the year before, the same with tomatoes. So you do a rotation. Lots of gardeners and farmers need to do rotation to prevent negative soil feedback from affecting the crop in the next year. In plant invasions and in plant soil feedbacks, it can take two different forms still. You can have a plant that conditions the soil, and if you follow the upper trajectory, it may result in this plant becoming bigger. We see that introducing more biomass and more competitive. There is a path that particular introduced plants can do, that they facilitate growth of soil microorganisms that are to the competitor. So an indirect effect. So the plant then benefits from the suppression that happens from the microbial communities of their competitors and can become bigger. That's one of the pathways that some invasive plants have been able to become super competitors. The other path, and that's much more common, is that soils are conditioned by a plant. And if you were to grow the same species in those soils, the performance of the plant, both in terms of biomass production or survival or output, seed output, is greatly reduced. We call that negative plant soil feedback. That seems to be happening for a lot of plants as well. And so that is what we suspect is actually happening for garlic mustard. As it grows in these soils, it creates microbial communities that are suppressive to itself. So over time, it loses vigor. That takes a while from it materializing. It may happen over multiple years, as we saw in our field experiment, and it's very localized. So plant communities, or the microbial communities, are right around the rhizosphere of the plant. So if the plant hasn't been grown in those places before, those microbial communities, they don't necessarily move much. They stay very localized. So you can have a patch of garlic mustard and you have soil condition happen in that particular patch. And if you take a couple of steps and you hadn't had garlic mustard in that place before, that soil may not be conditioned. However, the transfer from the conditioned soil to unconditioned soil, should garlic mustard grow there, is obviously facilitated because the distance is smaller and other organisms may move the microbes from one place to the other. So what seems to be happening for garlic mustard and a whole bunch of other plants under these circumstances is this. So the abundance or biomass output or something else, we see a hypothetical rise and fall that may be specific to the site and also region, depending on the year since the initial invasion occurred. Remember the garlic mustard sequence going from east to west, that would affect how the decline in garlic mustard happened over time. That may be influenced by disturbance, regional processes, the biota that are there, or as I said, the time since invasion. So the way that this happens think about a pebble that goes in and you throw it into a pond, and garlic mustard would spread over time while the center of where you threw a pebble into a pond is quiet once again. So at that time, garlic mustard is spreading rapidly in areas that it never occupied, but it has largely disappeared. That disturbance or that invasion has disappeared locally. People always ask me how long would it take for garlic mustard to return, and so what I initially had created was a non-dynamic visualization. But I think when we think about forest fires, it's probably the much better thing. This is a burned out landscape. I believe it's somewhere in Oregon that I found on the web. And so my response to those folks that were saying, doesn't garlic mustard come back to the places where it has gone? We haven't seen that in over a decade or longer. So we have long observation periods. And the pebble in the pond is not a good example because you can throw another pebble in and it would run over the area that was quiet. But if an area that has burned will not be burned immediately afterwards. And so the suppression of garlic mustard may happen for a much longer time than here in a forest situation. You would be able to regrow the trees and then the flammable materials are back again. But you can almost visualize this, be a garlic mustard infestation in these different patches that then run out of fuel. It's not just happening for garlic mustard. We have some evidence from a number of different places, including New Zealand and Eastern US forest, where negative soil feedback may happen over time. This was documented for New Zealand here, and these little letter codes are all different species that have a different number, or I'm sorry, have a different residence time in New Zealand from, this is years since establishment, well over 200 years to something very recent. And Dietz and others measured the suppression by planting, we call it soil conditionings, by planting these species into soils, allowing them to be conditioned, and planted the same species into these soils again. And what they found over time was the suppressive effect of the soils was stronger. The vulnerability of the species that were in the area larger, the longer the residence time was in North America. That's indeed a little over a decade ago that was published in Ecology Letters. And then Warren just very recently, just 2 years ago, published something that they retrieved from the National Park Service and the incidence of introduced species in permanent or in the forest inventory plots. And so what you can kind of see here, these are northeastern US forests, that the non-native invasive species richness, so this is the number of species over time, over the 300 and something years that they were looking at, is peaking at 100 to 200 years and then declines to very little. So the way to interpret this graph is that as plant species are invading, the number of forest inventory plots that are occupied by a particular species obviously increases because it runs across the landscape. If you were to do this for garlic mustard, most likely you would still see that it may be in the increasing phase because it's still expanding population in areas that it hasn't occupied. But the longer the residence time is for the species that are there, the more they actually declining in frequency in these places. So if we sum this up, there's a couple of ecological insights. One is earthworm first, garlic mustard second. So don't blame garlic mustard on the effects that the earthworms are having. There seem to be no permanent negative effects in the field. There are some effects that people have measured, particularly on mycorrhizae and others, but they were done in pot experiments, and we don't seem to be having the permanent negative effects in the field. So I'm not contesting that there are no effects that you can measure, but they are probably not permanent. There are multiple stressors that are involved. There are deer involved, there are earthworms involved. Garlic mustard is not a driver of the negative effects that you're seeing in the woods. The rise and fall of garlic mustard has an identical pattern from New Jersey to Illinois and probably beyond. The time frame since colonization to the initial invasion will affect how the process shapes out. The declines are locally happening within 5 to 20 years, depending on where you are. And of what you're doing to garlic mustard. We'll be talking about that in a moment. We have local extinction at the square meter level, but the colonization of new sites continues because if garlic mustard hasn't been there yet, then the site is vulnerable because you don't have the microbial community present that would suppress garlic mustard. The declines are accelerated by deer exclusion. That was documented by Susan Callis in Pennsylvania. We think that negative soil feedback is the ultimate mechanism for it all, and there is no management or no biocontrol necessary. That's kind of where I come down, and it's where the person on the bench is much more successful than the person sitting on its knees and on his or her knees and weeding in the woods. So contrary to other reports, there are no negative effects of garlic mustard residence time. We have seen this all over the place. As I said, it's an old slide. Tests are in progress. We're still looking at that. But garlic mustard and trilliums and others can have a happy coexistence. We don't see it as long as you take care of the deer. What you should not be doing is this. And I know this is the time where people are preparing for garlic mustard challenges and pulling it out by the bucket, truckload, armful, however you want to do this. This actually is the worst thing that you can do, not only because of the trampling effects. You're not going to be able to control populations of garlic mustard, but the most important thing is by doing this, you prevent the negative soil feed bump from actually occurring. So if you remove garlic mustard from an area, you remove the food and the selective forces to create the microbial communities that over time would suppress garlic mustard. So those of you that may have participated in some of these activities will know that year after year or every other year, you go back to the very same places and do the same thing over and over again. What's not shown in these pictures, although you can see it a little bit in the lower left-hand corner, is the trampling effect. By doing this, I don't know how many native seedlings and other things you will actually negatively affect. Nobody ever measures that. And the success is not in the amount of garlic mustard removed, but in the return of native species to these areas. And very few people ever report on their success. The big thing that's obvious for me, if I look at something like this, I'm not blaming this individual here, but if you look at this forest, garlic mustard is not the problem in this forest. This is just a forest that hammered by deer, so that you have nothing in the forest understory in a place that looks like in May or something like that. Also looking at the garlic mustard phenology. This is a heavily earthworm and deer infested woods. That's the problem. So you need to affect that. That will not only suppress garlic mustard faster than if you don't do anything, but it will also allow a return of the native vegetation that we ultimately are desiring in these places, and the insects and birds and mammals that would live off these places. So my recommendation for all of you, if you want thriving woodlands, either sit on your bench and don't do anything, or do this, much more of this. And that is a challenge right now, to work with management agencies, wildlife agencies, to reduce the deer abundance in your forests. If you want to protect your native plants and you can't do this, go and protect your native plants by fencing them. So that's the most important message that I can actually give out to you. With that, I'm going to end this here. I'm going to turn on my screen or my video, and I will be happy to answer one or two or more questions that you may be having. So thank you very much for the opportunity to address this here, and maybe I'm stopping some garlic mustard challenges from happening this year. We'll see if, yeah.
Thank you so much, Bernd. That was great, very interesting, and you've got a lot of questions coming in. So I'll start by reading them to you, and you can answer them as we go. So our first question came in early on in your talk from Stuart, and he wanted to know why garlic mustard was selected and why other problematic invasives such as Japanese knotweed were not.
Selected for what? For biocontrol or study?
I'm assuming for the study and maybe for the biocontrol.
So that wasn't my selection. That was a selection that the National Areas managers were doing. So I had been involved with them on trying to develop and implement biocontrol, and they were involved in purple loosestrife. And so then afterwards, when we were at meetings, they said, what other species should we be focusing on? And the consensus was garlic mustard is the biggest problem, as Charlotte also showed in her work surveying the natural areas managers in the Northeast. So I tried to be responsive to what at that point was considered one of the major problematic invaders in the US. Now, why Japanese knotweed wasn't selected at that time wasn't on the radar screen for a lot of people further east. We are now trying to develop biocontrol for Japanese knotweed, so it hasn't dropped off the radar screen at all. But it was a species that was very, very high on the list of a lot of land managers. That's how the selection appeared.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question comes from Chris. Have you done or seen any work examining whether climatic differences contribute to the differences you saw between the Northeast and Midwest populations?
So we tried to model that a little bit about what factors are responsible, right? And so you can use the region is a surrogate for different climates, but there are different soils, there are different land use histories. So to disentangle that is problematic. The only reasonable thing that we know is that it will have an influence, but the colonization history, how long a species has been in the area, was a very strong thing, particularly as we are going from east to west. There was a continuation of the effect of longitude on that one. I don't know whether anybody is actually measuring this right now, and it would take a very, very long time to disentangle that. Right, many sites, many chronosequences that you would need to do. So we ultimately weren't able to put this all into a project that required so much time and so many different collaborators.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Nancy. Hello, Nancy. And she would like for you to explain the Warren et al. Graph again. What does each point represent? She didn't follow you.
Which one is that?
Warren et al.
Warren. Okay. So you see a bell-shaped curve in Warren, and so basically they used forest inventory plots where they go to the same location over and over again and record presence and cover of herbaceous and other species. So that's what they used, and so all the different dots were was the presence of invasive species based on how long they had been existing in the Northeast, right? We kind of know when garlic mustard came in, when it was first recorded. We knew it for a lot of other species within a certain time frame. So we know some species arrived earlier, some are more recent arrivals. And if you plot that, you can see that the frequency of them in the forest inventory plots early on increases because it spreads across the landscape. Once the areas that it can invade basically have been saturated, it seems to be declining in frequency. It doesn't stay, so basically it doesn't occupy the areas that it was able to invade. It actually declines over time. And we see it for a whole bunch of different species. Yeah, I hope that answers this. Otherwise, drop me an email and I will try to answer that again if I can.
Great, thank you, Bernd. Okay, our next question comes from Marion, and she would like to know how you address the loss of native plants in the community during the 5 to 20 year period that I'm assuming that you're waiting for garlic mustard populations to.
So remember, the loss of native plants in a community is not driven by garlic mustard. Remember the slide that I showed from Illinois, where the native plant communities were doing just fine. All the species were doing just fine in the presence of garlic mustard. They did not decline. The decline of native species in a community is driven by earthworms or largely by deer. You put a fence around the area, your native species will not return because sometimes they have been totally eradicated from an area. For them to return to your woodlands or what you would like to protect, you may need to put out seeds or even better seedlings. And they will not just return, but garlic mustard does not suppress your native plants. So the association that you make with garlic mustard coming in and native plants have disappeared is that the deer in the area that are driving these processes. Garlic mustard follows earthworm invasion and deer. Garlic mustard does not drive native plant species away.
Great, thanks. Our next question comes from Linda. And she'd like to know, what if garlic mustard is removed and the area is immediately replanted with native species?
Well, the only time that I suggest you do that is if you find the very first plant, or the very first 2 or 3 plants. Because if you remove garlic mustard, what are you removing? You're removing the existing plants. You do not remove the seed bank. So for a decade afterwards, you're going to have garlic mustard keep on growing. Are you keep on removing them, doing the soil disturbance that may actually uproot the native plant seedlings that would like to grow? And so it's detrimental. It is impossible. Only if you find the very first few individuals in an area that's far removed from the next garlic mustard infestation, would I still suggest you pull it out. That's okay. If you have a seed bank, you don't stand a chance. That's what it is. So the reward for a garlic mustard challenge, if you ever do this, is for the person who goes out and finds the single individual. But I always know that the garlic mustard challenge rewards the person or the group who brings the most tonnage out of the woods. That's just the wrong thing to do. You need to find that first colonizing individual. But again, it's not a useful thing to do.
Okay, our next question comes from Christina, and she'd like to know if there are any other species you would give the same recommendation for management and or that you would expect to have similar outcomes if studied as closely.
Yes,
great
the next one that comes to mind is microstegium. I don't know, I guess it was Christina where you are located, but obviously microstegium, Japanese stiltgrass, is spreading all over the place. As an annual grass, it's even stronger responding to the not elimination, but the reduction in deer abundance. We are not the only people who are reporting that. You put a fence around an area, or you have an area that's fenced, either Japanese stiltgrass is not able to invade, or it declines in abundance 80% or more very drastically. I've just heard from one of our former lab members, Andrea Davalos, who is documenting similar declines in swallowwort. So I kind of suspected that that may be happening. So our recommendation is, if you really want to understand where similar processes are happening across the board, set aside some areas where you, one, don't do anything and see what happens to this area, and fence it to document it in your area. I'm pretty confident, because we haven't published this for a long time, because we are always afraid. We publish it and then garlic mustard comes back in a vengeance, right? So ha ha ha, that's the revenge effect of the plant invader. So we didn't do that. But we're very confident now that this is not happening. So yes, I suspect many more species will be following this pathway. Will all the species following this pathway? I don't think so, but which ones will and which ones won't, we will not know without actually observing the species and having the wisdom to look for a while, maybe doing an intervention that is not as drastic at constantly spraying and weeding and hacking away at the plant invaders, but understanding their ecology and how they are embedded in a network of what we call all these other multiple stressors. That may allow us to relax a little bit more, but patience is required, right? So this doesn't happen over time. 2 years will not tell you the story. A graduate student thesis will not tell you the full story. It has to be done longer. And so, as I said, patience and some serenity and some setbacks will be required to look at that.
Well, you did a great job also answering the next question, which was about residence time of black swallowwort and Japanese stiltgrass, and if you expect to see similar patterns. So we'll move on to Stuart's question. So he just wanted to reinforce, so this spring he should not pull his garlic mustard, but should he pull his Japanese knotweed, which he does monthly throughout the growing season? Any comments on Japanese knotweed?
Yeah, good luck with that. That's one of the ones where I feel, oh my God, are we saying we should take the hands off? No, I'm not taking the hands off of Japanese knotweed, right? So we're actively pursuing developing biological control for the species. That's one where I feel, and that's not a weak invader like garlic mustard is. Keep at it, but make sure that you're not facilitate the return of native species. So fencing Japanese knotweed may be one thing if it's at the edge of the woods. and then still pulling it on the inside and doing some restoration. But I've been at it and some of the properties on our land for well over a decade, and it's still there. And that was with a rotary cutter and a tractor. The patches have gotten smaller, but they're still there.
And so the next question is about mowing garlic mustard. If garlic mustard is in an area that needs to be mowed, do you recommend mowing as usual?
Now, where is garlic mustard in an area that needs to be mowed? That seems to be like a field edge or so, because hopefully there's no mowing in the woods. That would set back the native plant species. And there are some places, let's put it this way, where we have seen garlic mustard being very, very slow and declining. Forest edges, full sunlight, roadsides, are some of them where that process may be much slower. I have a particular intersection here on 79 and Pine Tree Road in the town of Ithaca, where I've watched garlic mustard for 20 years because it's along my path to the university. It has now started to decline, but if you have constant disturbances, mowing, maybe also road salt or other things, maybe the microbial communities are not responding or don't have the potential to suppress garlic mustard in a way that we see in our woodlands. So your mowing question, if it's a field, without more information, I can't say much about it, because typically that is not something that people would do. Again, drop me an email. I will try to help. But yeah. Oh, it's in a pasture. Yeah. Is it creating a problem in the pasture? And what would the problem be if it's in the pasture?
Okay. Well, Bernd, we'll put your email, since you're offering to answer questions via email, which is very generous. We'll put your email into the chat box here, and people can reach out to you for some of these questions that they want further information on. The next question is from Emily, and she would like more information on what data has been collected or is in progress on the impact on native plants when we don't manage garlic mustard, not just on percent cover, but also on overall species diversity.
Again, you need to do this in a multiple stressor framework. So I think Vicky's data are published in AOB Plants from Fermilab. You can do your own studies, which I suggest you actually do, by trying to plant native species into garlic mustard and see how well they are doing. So when we put our fences up and we have garlic mustard in a situation, some of the species that we looked at are listed on that graph or on the publication slide that I showed. That has been published. Garlic mustard is never an effect on rare species there. You can plant your species that you would like to recruit into garlic mustard and see how well they do. Convince yourself in those places, but don't plant it out without protecting it from deer herbivory. So you can plant it out in earthworm invaded areas, do a little TLC so that it gets to the initial phase. As you are transplanting in it, you will see it will thrive in garlic mustard infested areas, and garlic mustard will go away over time. That's my suggestion, to convince yourself that this is actually working. And we have done some stuff, other people have done some stuff too. I can share that. Yeah. I see a question about Phragmites in there. Let me tell you, Sarah, I have no hope for negative soil feedback in Phragmites, because Phragmites seems to be one of the species that uses this ADAP pathway, that it selectively suppresses native plant species for its own benefit. We see that. But interestingly enough, nobody has done a study trying to understand how Phragmites is being affected or its success increased by deer herbivory in wetlands. We will do in that study. We are planning that with a restoration effort here in New York. So stay tuned. In a few years, we may have something more to say about that.
Okay. I'm going to skip around a little bit. It's already 12, but if you're okay with it, Bernd, maybe we can go 5 minutes over and try
That's
to get
fine.
through because there's so many questions coming in. But what I was wondering is if we wanted to touch a little bit on the earthworm question. And one of our participants would like to know if there's any effective actions to prevent or control earthworm invasions, and is deer exclusion also effective on earthworm impact?
Let me answer the last part first. If you exclude deer, earthworms decline dramatically over time to a point where they're almost non-existent. Now, that doesn't happen at a square meter. You need to enclose larger areas. We have published on that one. That was not part of the publication slide that I have. Other people have seen the same effect. So fencing out earthworm, I wish we could fence out earthworms. We can't do that. We fence out deer, will manage earthworm abundance and biomass, and it will affect invasive plants that are to some extent interacting with introduced earthworms, and they facilitate each other and increase each other. So Carrie, can you tell me the first part of the question? So deer affect earthworms that facilitate their abundance. If you fence it, earthworms will decline. So will their negative effect, which are not necessarily on plants, but more on the biota that live in the little layer and things that eat cribbly crawlies out of the little layer. What was the first part of your question, Carrie, or the question that was asked?
Yeah. Are there effective actions to prevent or control earthworm invasion?
So to prevent earthworm impacts, no, other than the fencing to take the deer out of an area. The most important recommendation that I have is if you do restoration in your areas, please use plants that you recruit yourself that are grown in earthworm-free soils. Do not use that you do not know how they were regenerated. Invasive earthworms, particularly jumping worms, were spread in Wisconsin through the native plant exchange that happened at the Madison Herbarium. So people wanted to garden with native plants, help restore native plants into the woodlands, and what they were doing were actually bringing detrimental impacts into the woods, not knowing what was happening at that time. So doing restoration, most important, prevent introduction. Once the earthworms are in, you don't have a chance. So how do you prevent introduction? Garden with seeds or recruit your own plants, because anything that's nursery grown, you have no guarantee that there are no earthworms in there. So that's, or do bare root and clean that. So that's an important suggestion. Then if you need to do forestry management in your areas, make sure that the equipment is cleaned. That's how earthworms and their cocoons are arriving in those places. Please do not introduce mulch from areas from outside where you are. I don't do that. I produce my own chipping material and mulch here if I need to amend soils. That's another important aspect on how things get into her. And then if you have places where there is hiking and others, the soles of your hiking boots will carry earthworm cocoons as well. So that's what we're seeing. So prevent that. That's the best thing that you can do. There's no control for earthworms at the present time, other than fencing out the deer.
I'd like to take this opportunity to make a plug for a new expert working group that Nisri's been working with here in New York. It's called JWorm, and they're producing information with recommendations on how to prevent earthworm introductions and also how to manage current ones as best possible to avoid further spread. And so maybe Audrey can throw the web address into the email, in that there'll be a document that'll be available within the very near future. Okay, we've got maybe 1 more minute. So if you would like to maybe comment on.
I see a question about perilla. I don't know what perilla is. Ellie, please put it into the chat and I will try to answer that.
All right. Well, okay, is a beefsteak plant.
I don't know what that is either. So do you have a Latin? I'm going to answer the question about buckthorn. So what we see, what you described there, Mark, is very often happening. You know, you take out Japanese knotweed and garlic mustard come back. You cleared buckthorn, garlic mustard come back, or something else. And then black-cap raspberry displaced the garlic mustard, so it's less of a problem for me now. What is replacing garlic mustard in central Minnesota will depend on what you have in the area. So again, it goes back to what I said. If you have deer eliminating native plants in the area, you need to do active restoration, whatever will grow in your area. That's depending on the place that you're at, moisture levels, soil levels, all kinds of different things may thrive in an area. But it will not just come if you take out plant invaders, whether that's buckthorn or whether that's Japanese knotweed or garlic mustard. In many places, deer have eliminated all the plants that could produce seed or even the plant individuals. So for active restoration, you need to look around what will grow into your soils, then introduce it. Good luck with the black raspberry in there. That seems like an impenetrable thicket sometimes as well. But I have trillium growing under raspberry. It may not be black-cap raspberry, but it grows very successfully. But work with your local sources and then protect them from deer browse. That's really, really important. Perilla frutescens. I don't know, Ellie. I would need to take a look at that. I have not encountered it, so I'm sorry. Maybe it is very recent, but I can take a look at that. Send me an email about it, and I will do a little bit of background work. And but most likely, so I haven't heard of it before. Interesting name, beefsteak plant. So I want to take a look at that just to be intrigued about it.
Okay, Bernd, how do you want, would you like to keep going here?
Yeah, because I'm just going to read what comes in. So how does deer exclusion affect earthworm populations? I wish I would be able to know the answer to that. We know the effect. We are not the only ones seeing it. It's done in the Cleveland Metro Parks area. Some other people have looked at that. So that seems a pattern that holds across the board, and we have looked at many different sites. We think it's a microbial feedback loop, maybe through urination, defecation of the deer, and nutrient transport in there, but we don't have a good mechanism for it. Right now, we do not know. It was a surprise effect for us. There was a number of ecological surprises. One was the decline of introduced plant species. The other one was the decline of earthworm populations when we fence out deer. We were not expecting that at the beginning, but we looked at earthworm populations as one of the other stressors to see that interactive effect, and what the ultimate cause for that is. The mechanistic explanation in science speak, we don't know. We suspect a microbial feedback loop, but we don't know. Okay. I don't know whether you see any more, Carrie, or whether I satisfied the curiosity.
I think you've covered most of them. So why don't we close the session for today? I just wanted to thank everybody for participating, and also Bernd, thank you so much for taking the time to share this interesting research. As I mentioned, Bernd's email is in the chat box, so if there's any further follow-up questions that you'd like to ask him, please shoot him an email. And with that, there will be other National Invasive Species Awareness Week presentations hosted by NASMA and the Forest Service. If you look at our NISRI website, we have many of those posted there, and you can link in for the last couple of days to get more information on invasive species. And thanks again to Bernd, and everyone have a great day.